Her son moved strangers into her bedroom while she was still recovering from surgery. Margaret Delaney, retired librarian and widow, didn't scream. Brandon, once her boy and now her burden, said it was temporary, then handed her the guest room. By month's end, the deed was no longer in her name, but neither was the house. She'd spent a lifetime building a home, then sold it without telling a soul, and when they begged to stay, her silence did what love no longer could. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The cab idled at the curb just long enough for the driver to awkwardly ask if she needed help with the steps. "I've got it," Margaret said, lifting her suitcase handle with her left hand and clutching the metal railing with her right. Her gait was uneven, the hip still stiff from surgery, but she moved with the kind of grace that refused to be pitied. The house looked the same from the outside, same faded shutters, same overgrown azaleas crowding the walkway. She'd expected it to feel like a return. Instead, it felt like arriving somewhere someone else had been living without her. She pushed open the front door. Voices floated down the hallway. Not Brandon's, not Lacey's either. Two unfamiliar coats hung on the hallway hooks, a heavy men's fleece and a bright floral jacket Margaret had never seen. A woman's laugh rang out from somewhere toward the back of the house. Margaret's fingers gripped the suitcase tighter. She moved through the living room slowly, wheels squeaking against the floorboards. The faint scent of citrus cleaner lingered. Lacey's choice, not hers. In the hallway, the door to her bedroom was wide open. She froze. Luggage, matching, monogrammed. A long robe hanging off the closet handle. Someone's loafers tucked neatly beneath her nightstand, a ceramic diffuser pulsing faint lavender across the room. Then the voice. "Oh, you must try the memory foam. Honestly, my sciatica hasn't flared once since we got here." Margaret turned toward the sound just as Lacey's mother, Janice, always overly perfumed and under-boundaried, stepped out of her master bathroom, completely barefoot and smiling like she belonged there. "Oh, you're early," she chirped. Before Margaret could respond, Lacey appeared, brushing crumbs off her leggings. "We didn't expect you till Thursday," she said, as if the issue was her timing, not the invasion. "I signed discharge papers yesterday," Margaret said, her voice clipped but even. Brandon came down the stairs, barefoot, holding his phone like it had something better to do than this moment. "Hey, Mom. Welcome back," he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek like they were a sitcom family, like her master bedroom wasn't currently occupied by strangers. She didn't offer her cheek. "What's going on?" she asked quietly. Brandon gestured lazily toward the bedroom. "Just temporary. Lacey's folks have been staying here to help with the kids while you were recovering." Janice cut in brightly. "And that mattress of yours is just so good for Ron's back. The guest bed's too soft for him." "You'll be fine in the other room?" Brandon added. "It's only for a little while." Margaret looked down the hall. The guest room, smaller, no ensuite, the one with the flickering overhead light and the peeling paint above the window from where the rain had leaked last year. She nodded once. Just once. Then wheeled her suitcase down the hall. She didn't ask for help. She didn't slam the door. She just sat on the edge of the guest bed, one hip stiff and humming with pain, and stared at the blank wall where she used to hang her late husband's watercolor of the Rockies. It was gone, probably in the garage. Or worse, boxed without care. She changed into pajamas and unpacked nothing. Dinner was leftovers, something vaguely beige in a Tupperware that smelled like refrigerator and indifference. She ate it in the dim silence of her kitchen, lit only by the bulb above the stove. From the living room came clinks of wine glasses. Laughter. Someone retelling a story that wasn't hers. Brandon's voice rising, then Lacey's, then Janice again, loud and unfiltered. Margaret chewed slowly. No one asked if she needed anything. No one asked how the rehab went. She rinsed her plate, dried it, and slid it back into the cabinet like it hadn't been used at all. As she turned to leave the kitchen, she caught her reflection in the microwave door. Sharp, gray eyes. Fine lines. Mouth pressed into something unreadable. She touched the edge of the counter with one hand, then whispered to no one. So, this is how it starts. Margaret bought a small spiral notebook from the corner drugstore. Plain blue cover, wide-ruled, nothing fancy. She slipped it into the drawer beside her bed, beneath a stack of crossword books and a jar of menthol rub no one but her ever touched. She didn't write in it daily, only when something shifted. Tuesday, 9:16 a.m., heard Janice on speakerphone planning a brunch with the girls from back home for Saturday. No one asked me. Wednesday, 6:44 p.m., bathroom towel replaced with their monogrammed set. My robe missing from back of door. She wrote neatly, precisely. Time, date, behavior. No adjectives, no emotion, just facts. One afternoon, she opened her laptop at the kitchen table and typed in, Real Estate Attorney, Elder Ownership, Colorado, Private Inquiry. She clicked the fourth result. The headshot was plain, no big smile, no billboard charisma, just a firm name and a phone number. She called and left a voicemail. Name's Margaret Delaney. I'm not in crisis. I just have some questions about property sale logistics and ownership protections. She clicked end, then put the phone face down on the table and sat still for 10 full minutes. That evening, the guest bathroom mirror bore a dry erase label, Maggie's room, complete with a winking face drawn beside it. Margaret stared at it for a long time. Later, when the house was quiet, she wiped it clean with the edge of her sleeve. By the end of the week, Janice and Ron had hosted 3 different couples. Lacey gave a casual laugh when Margaret asked who was coming in and out of the house. Oh, just friends of my parents. They're helping us network for Brandon's job hunt. You don't mind, right? Margaret looked at her. Are they staying overnight? No, of course not, Lacey said, but her tone made the question sound ridiculous. That night, Margaret stood in the darkened hallway, looking toward her old bedroom where light spilled out beneath the door. She could hear someone snoring. Not Brandon, not Lacey. She turned and walked back to her own room, the one with the creaky bed frame and the draft that came in from the warped window frame. She didn't sleep. The next morning, Brandon stood in the doorway with a bowl of cereal and a smile he wore like it had been rehearsed. You know, Mom, I think we all just need to get on the same page. They're family, too. We're blending, that's all. Margaret stirred her tea. Didn't look up. Not mine, she said. He shifted uncomfortably. They've been helping. Lacey's dad fixed the garage light. I didn't ask him to. It's not a big deal. Margaret finally looked at him. Then why does it feel like I'm the guest in my own house? He didn't answer. Instead, he muttered something about needing to call a recruiter and left the room. She watched his cereal bowl slosh milk onto the hardwood as he walked away. He didn't notice. That afternoon, Margaret opened a new checking account at a different credit union. Just her name. No linked cards. No joint access. The teller was young, polite, didn't ask questions. Would you like paper statements or online only? Paper, Margaret said. I want to touch what's mine. That evening, she slipped her new checkbook into the back of her sock drawer and started moving over small auto payments. Quiet ones, the cable bill, the house insurance, Netflix. It would take time. She wasn't in a rush. Before bed, she made one more note in the spiral notebook. Friday, 11:32 p.m. House feels different, not haunted, just borrowed. She clicked off the lamp. From down the hallway came the sound of Janice's laugh. Margaret turned toward the ceiling and whispered, Start counting. I am. Margaret chose the diner carefully, not too close, not too nice, just far enough across town that no one would recognize her, and just forgettable enough that no one would care. She arrived 15 minutes early, took the booth farthest from the window, and ordered a single black coffee she barely touched. The real estate agent showed up 5 minutes late, still in a navy blazer with a tag string poking from the sleeve hem. John Alder, he said, offering a hand. Margaret Delaney, she replied. Her grip was firm. Let's not waste time. John sat, opened a folder, and adjusted his glasses. So I saw the property details you submitted. Lovely place. You mentioned discretion? I don't want signs. No open houses, no pre-closing visits? John blinked. Okay, that's a bit unusual, but we can do a private listing. And cash only, she added. His brow lifted slightly. That narrows the pool. "I'm not looking for a pool," she said. "Just one clean swimmer." John chuckled once, then flipped to a clean sheet of paper. "What kind of timeline are you imagining? 3 weeks from the day it's listed, I'll vacate before the buyer gets keys. Is your son on the deed?" "No," she said flatly. He glanced up again. "I ask because sometimes—" "He lives there," she added. "So do his in-laws." John paused. Margaret held his gaze. "But none of them have a legal claim." "I checked." He nodded slowly. "Got it. Privacy, efficiency, no familial interference." She sipped her coffee for the first time. "Exactly." An hour later, the handshake was done. John promised to draw up a quiet listing draft. She promised to think about staging, then added, "Don't count on it." The drive home felt shorter than it should have. Her hands didn't tremble, but they were tight on the wheel. When she stepped inside, the air felt wrong. The quiet was too symmetrical. She moved down the hall, heels clicking against the tile. Her sewing table, the antique one Henry bought her for their 10th anniversary, was missing from the living room alcove. The corner where she used to sit and thread grief into patchwork after he died was empty now, replaced by a fake ficus and a mirror Margaret had never seen before. She walked to the garage. There it sat, pushed against the back wall, a roll of pink insulation resting on top like an afterthought. The sewing machine itself still covered, but the threads she'd left half-spooled now tangled in the mess of a storage bin labeled Misk. She stood there a moment longer than necessary, just long enough. Lacey passed behind her in the kitchen and noticed her stillness. "Oh, yeah, we moved the table," she said, voice light. "It just didn't match the energy of the space. We thought a reading nook would flow better." "Whose energy?" Margaret asked. Lacey shrugged. "Everyone's, really." Margaret said nothing. She walked back to the living room, sat in the recliner, the one Janice liked to call dated, and stared at the spot where her history used to sit. Later that night, in her notebook, she wrote, "Monday, 8:05 p.m. Sewing table relocated without consent. Didn't match the energy. Neither do I, apparently." She drew a small square beside the entry and colored it in with slow, even strokes. Then she tucked the notebook away and pulled out the folder John had given her. Draft listing, property comps, closing checklist. At the bottom, in neat print, was John's note. "We can move quietly. You just say when." Margaret flipped the paper over, found the blank back, and wrote in blue pen, "Almost time." The estate attorney's office smelled like ink and leather and restraint. Margaret sat across from a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a voice as efficient as a paper cutter. Her name was Vanessa. No small talk, just business. Exactly how Margaret liked it. "Let's walk through your current trust setup," Vanessa said, flipping open a file. "Brandon Delaney is listed as co-trustee with shared authority. Do you wish to retain that?" Margaret shook her head once. "Number I want him removed. Effective immediately." Vanessa didn't flinch. "And you'd like to retain full control?" "Yes, sole trustee. No one else touches anything without my signature, ever." "Understood," Vanessa said, already typing. "And your successor trustee?" Margaret paused. "That name will come later." They moved line by line. Healthcare proxy, power of attorney, inheritance clauses. Margaret eliminated every route Brandon could have used to inch his way into decisions meant only for her. When they were done, Vanessa handed her the pen. Margaret signed without hesitation, no ceremony, no flourish. Just ink sealing the end of a rope Brandon hadn't realized she'd been cutting, one knot at a time. The next morning, she boxed up the pearl earrings Henry gave her for their 25th anniversary. The deed to the house, her birth certificate, her will. She added the wedding ring she no longer wore but still polished once a year. Then she drove to the bank and opened a safety deposit box under her name alone. No authorized users. No one listed as next of kin. "Do you want to leave an access note for a family member?" the clerk asked politely. Margaret smiled, slow and unreadable. "No." Afterward, she stopped by the post office and signed the form to open a new P.O. box. She rerouted her Medicare paperwork, her Social Security updates, even the coupon flyer she only read when she was feeling nostalgic. That night, she slipped the new key into a tea tin labeled lavender in the back of her pantry. Brandon was already asleep when she returned, or pretending to be. 2 days later, Tina came by under the pretense of dropping off lemon bars, but the real reason filled her trunk. Heirlooms wrapped in newspaper, a stack of Margaret's journals, and the porcelain clock Henry's father had brought back from Vienna in 1953. They didn't speak much, just labeled each box, taped each seam, and carried them out one by one. "Is this a getaway or an escape?" Tina asked once. Margaret smiled faintly. "This is a transfer of ownership, from vulnerable to prepared." Tina grinned. "I'll drink to that." Later that week, Brandon knocked on her door just after 10 p.m., holding 2 mugs of lukewarm chamomile. "Can we talk?" he asked, standing in the guest room doorway like a man still convinced his charm held power here. She nodded. Not warmly, just enough to let him speak. He sat on the edge of the guest chair, stared into the mug like it had answers. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "with rates the way they are, maybe it makes sense to refinance the house. Pull a little equity. You'd get a payout. We could finish the backyard, maybe even redo the upstairs bath." Margaret didn't blink. "It's not your house to refinance." "I know," he said quickly. "I meant as a team, a family project." She took the mug, didn't sip. "What would you use the money for?" she asked. He hesitated. "You know, Lacey's car's on its last leg. Her parents, they've been good about not asking for help, but you know they're on fixed income too. It'd give us some breathing room." Margaret set the mug down on the nightstand with a soft click. "I'll think about it," she said. He smiled, a flicker of the boy he used to be. But Margaret had already written the final entry in her notebook that morning. Thursday, 10:19 a.m. Removed from trust, safety deposit secure, P.O. box active, refinance pitch is next. She wasn't watching the story unfold. She was writing it, and she'd just reached the part where the plot turns. At 7:58 a.m., Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a fresh pad of sticky notes, a lukewarm mug of Earl Grey, and the login screen to the private listing portal. She wasn't nervous. She was awake, more awake than she'd felt in weeks. The house was quiet. Janice and Ron were out walking the grandkids to the park. Lacey was at her stress relief yoga. Brandon had already left for work. At exactly 8 a.m., she clicked the button. List property, confirm. A silent screen refresh. The house was on the market. She sipped her tea and wrote a single note in her spiral log. Friday, 8:01 a.m. The walls have ears, but today they're mine. By 8:45, John had texted, 2 private offers, both cash, 1 over asking. At 10:17, 3 more. And at 11:03 a.m., call me. John. She stepped out onto the back porch to avoid the walls. The wind was dry, the kind that hinted at wildfire season. Her hip ached a little from the early morning chill, but she didn't sit down. "Full cash?" she asked over the phone. "No contingencies," John replied. "And the highest bidder? He's the paramedic I mentioned, name's John Keller. Solid guy, wants to move fast, keep it clean. He's offering full price plus a flexible leaseback if you need it." "I won't," she said. "But I want the minimum close date, 21 days. "Done," he already agreed. Margaret didn't smile, but her spine straightened. She told him to move forward. At 3:42 p.m., John texted again. "DocuSign sent. Let me know when it's official." Margaret waited until she was alone, then poured a glass of Cabernet from the bottle Tina had dropped off the week prior. "For the moment it starts to feel real," her friend had said. She sat at the guest room desk, read every clause, every line, every embedded timestamp. Then she signed, name, date, initials. She took a long sip of wine, and when the confirmation email pinged, she didn't cry. She didn't even blink. Instead, she stood, looked around the room that had never belonged to her in the first place, and whispered, "4 walls are just structure, ownership is something else." That night, Brandon knocked gently on her door. "We're thinking of hosting a barbecue," he said, his voice falsely casual. "A big one. Just friends and family. Celebrate Lacey's folks being here so long. Thinking maybe 3 weekends from now?" She nodded, slow. "That's a lovely idea. His smile returned too quickly. Yeah? Let me know if you need help with the guest list. He walked away beaming. She closed the door behind him and picked up her pen. Friday, 9:24 p.m. He's planning a BBQ the same weekend we close. I'll let the calendar surprise him. The next morning, she began mentally dividing the house. What stayed? What left? What could burn, for all she cared? John Keller sent a thank you text at 7:18 a.m. Honored to be part of this. We'll treat it with care. JK. She responded with a simple, I believe you. Downstairs, Ron was in her recliner, watching golf. Lacey hummed while chopping garlic in her kitchen. Margaret opened the back door, stepped outside, and took a long breath of the Colorado air. Not yet crisp, not yet free, but soon. So very soon. The first box Margaret filled was labeled Keep Originals. She wrote it in neat Sharpie, then underlined it twice. Inside went the photo albums, leather-bound, not digital. Henry's letters from their first year of marriage, her teaching license, a faded envelope from 1976 with Brandon's first scribble of the word Mom. She held it for a beat longer than the others, then laid it flat on top. By noon, 3 boxes sat in the hallway. Keep, donate, store. She hadn't told anyone what she was doing. She didn't need permission to pack her own memories. Downstairs, Janice breezed through the kitchen with a glass of rosé and a spritz of perfume Margaret now associated with ownership theft. She paused at the boxes and tilted her head like a curious guest. Decluttering, Maggie? Margaret didn't look up from the china cabinet she was emptying. Something like that. Oh, that's wonderful. A fresh space is good for the soul. Janice tapped one of the donate boxes with a manicured finger. Makes room for new energy. Margaret smiled faintly. Exactly. Janice took it as agreement and floated off. That afternoon, Margaret cleared every cabinet in the dining room. The wedding china went into foam pouches and then into the keep pile. The mismatched mugs Lacey bought last winter, ironic sayings, chipped rims, zero memory, were dumped straight into a bin marked junk. Tina arrived at 2:15 with gardening gloves, black coffee, and a wild glint in her eyes. You tell me what's staying. I'll rip out the rest. They started with the curtains, thick beige ones from the early 2000s that Lacey had called vintage neutral. Margaret had always called them heavy dust magnets. Tina yanked them down rod by rod, rolled them like dead weight, and stuffed them into lawn bags. Rugs were next. One by one, the rolled-up patterns of someone else's taste were dragged into the garage. Tina laid them side by side and said, They look like a lineup of bad decisions. Margaret nodded. They were. They didn't stop until every wall-hugging relic that hadn't belonged to Margaret or Henry was exiled. By early evening, she was on hold with a local junk pickup service. Yes, she told the operator. Everything on the driveway. Nothing sentimental. Take it all. Even the mirror? The voice asked. Especially the mirror, Margaret said. Lacey returned just as the sun was setting, a yoga mat slung over her shoulder, cheeks flushed with effort. She stopped cold when she saw the driveway. What's all this? Things I don't need, Margaret replied, lifting another tote into the trunk of Tina's car. You could have asked. Some of it's still useful, Lacey said, eyeing a bench they'd bought during a Labor Day sale. Margaret didn't blink. To whom? I just meant. Margaret didn't let her finish. You're welcome to take anything off the pile before the truck comes tomorrow. After that, it's landfill bound. Lacey opened her mouth, then closed it. Inside, the house echoed. Not because it was empty, but because it finally made sense again. Later, Tina handed her a cool glass of ginger ale and said, You cleared a decade of clutter in 6 hours. Margaret exhaled. And none of it was mine. They sat in silence as dusk folded over the yard. Inside, the empty corners didn't feel hollow. They felt like promises. On her notebook that night, she wrote, Saturday, 8:03 p.m. 1 layer down, more beneath. Brandon hasn't noticed yet. He thinks I'm nesting. He doesn't know I'm shedding. She was about to close the book when a new noise stirred from the garage. Boxes shifting, a door creaking. She stepped to the window, just enough to see Ron lifting one of the discarded rugs and inspecting it. He looked around, then quietly dragged it back inside. She didn't stop him. but she did underline the last line of her note. "He doesn't know I'm shedding." She capped the pen and smiled, sharp and slow, as if she were finally starting to molt. Brandon's footsteps were heavier than usual. Margaret heard the door swing shut before the echo even had time to fade. He came in fast, too fast for someone with nothing to hide, and stopped in the middle of the freshly bare living room like he'd walked into someone else's home. "Are you kidding me?" he said. Margaret didn't turn from the sink. She rinsed her teacup slowly, then set it in the rack. "What exactly am I supposed to be kidding about? You sold the house?" His voice pitched up half a note. "You didn't even tell me." She dried her hands on a linen towel and faced him. Calm, quiet, braced. "I didn't need to." He laughed, not amused but disbelieving. "You've been acting weird, Mom, but this is impulsive. Honestly, it's disrespectful." Margaret tilted her head. "Disrespectful is moving your in-laws into my bedroom while I was in rehab." Brandon's mouth opened, then closed again. She let the silence sit between them like a third presence. "I just sold my house, Brandon," she continued, each word smooth as poured tea. "Nothing impulsive about that. Just long overdue." He dropped his keys onto the coffee table hard enough to make the coaster jump. "You could have talked to me," he said. "We're family. This affects all of us." Margaret nodded. "You're right. It does. The difference is, I didn't pretend it didn't when it was you making decisions." He rubbed the back of his neck, the first crack of uncertainty showing. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the formal notification of sale, signature date circled in blue. She placed it on the table. Brandon stared at it like it had betrayed him personally. "I could sue," he said finally. "You know that? I could claim undue influence. You're not in your prime anymore, Mom. A court could say you were pressured." Margaret didn't flinch. "I'm not in my prime," she said softly, "but I'm sharper than you've ever given me credit for." She reached for her phone and opened a message from her attorney. "I sent Vanessa a heads up. If you follow through, her response is ready. Everything's documented. Timeline, capacity, witnesses. You'll lose before the ink dries." His jaw tightened. Margaret stepped closer, not aggressive, just direct. "You had a choice. You could have honored this house. You chose to conquer it." He turned to leave, but just as his hand hit the doorknob, Lacey came in through the side entrance, phone in hand, brows lifted. "What's going on?" Brandon waved the paper in the air. "She sold the house." Lacey blinked. "Wait, what?" "She's serious," he said. "It's already in escrow." Lacey's lips parted, then clamped shut. For a moment her face cycled through confusion, disbelief, then something else, panic. "But where are my parents supposed to go?" Margaret looked at her. "The way you look at someone who's never truly seen you." "That was never my question to answer." "They helped," Lacey whispered. "They supported us. They gave—" Margaret raised a hand, gently. "Not to silence, but to separate. Your parents made themselves comfortable in a space they didn't earn. That comfort is expiring." Brandon stared at her like she was a stranger. Maybe she was, or maybe this was the version of her he'd never been brave enough to meet. "You blindsided us," he said. "No," Margaret replied. "You closed your eyes." She walked past him and opened the front door. "You'll need to find a new location for that BBQ." Brandon didn't move. Lacey's mouth was still open, but no sound came out. Margaret paused just before the hallway, pulled her notebook from the shelf, and jotted one line. "Sunday, 6:04 p.m. They think shock is strategy. They've mistaken silence for surrender." She capped the pen, then from the driveway came the rumble of a truck, the junk pickup, right on schedule. Margaret smiled faintly. Another layer off the walls, another illusion gone. And inside the hallway, unnoticed, the mail slot creaked open. A new letter fell to the floor. Legal-sized, certified, addressed to her, but stamped from Brandon's financial planner. The moving crew arrived at 8:01 a.m. sharp. 3 men in matching gray shirts stepped onto the porch, each one polite, professional, and paid in advance. Margaret handed them a typed inventory: 10 boxes, 2 pieces of furniture, 1 mirror. "Only the items on this list," she said. "Nothing else is to be touched." They nodded without questions. Margaret appreciated that. The movers began upstairs, careful with each labeled box. Kitchen, heirloom glass. Books, Margaret only. Bedroom, personal. She followed quietly, clipboard in hand, watching every turn. She didn't hover, but she didn't disappear either. By noon, her new space, a small, dignified rental on the edge of town, was full, sparse, intentional. Everything that mattered had made the journey, everything else stayed behind. At 12:42 p.m., Margaret returned alone to the house. She walked the hallway slowly, not out of nostalgia, but to confirm what had been taken, what had been left, what would be discarded like the entitlement it had arrived with. In the garage, she found a dusty bin labeled Brandon Baby Photos. She pulled out the contents, checked them for mold, wiped a few frames with her sleeve and packed them into a single cardboard box. She didn't write sentimental. She didn't write fragile. She wrote, "Leave in garage," for him. By the time she re-entered the living room, the last rug had been rolled. Her recliner, the real one, not the one Janice had claimed, was already loaded. Only one more item remained. The front door. She opened it wide and waited. At 3:10 p.m., a delivery van pulled up with the lockbox. "Digital keypad," the technician explained. "Only 2 users have the code, you and the buyer. Want to test it?" She punched in the numbers herself. Confirmed. Final. Unshared. By 3:30, the house was hollow, stripped of every trace of her stewardship, her marriage, her labor. It was no longer an offering. It was a countdown. At 3:58 p.m., a silver Camry pulled into the driveway. Janice and Ron stepped out carrying shopping bags, one full of snacks, the other of cleaning supplies Margaret hadn't asked for. They stopped mid-step when they saw the lawn. 2 mattresses, 1 foam topper, a plastic headboard. Janice blinked hard. What happened? Margaret didn't answer. She stood on the porch, hands folded. Ron stepped forward, confused. "Is this a renovation thing? Where's our stuff?" Margaret tilted her head toward the lockbox. "No entry after today," she said. Janice gaped. "But our bedroom, our things." "This isn't your bedroom," Margaret replied. "And they're not your things." Ron's mouth moved like he was going to protest, but no sound followed. Margaret turned and walked back inside. Brandon called 5 minutes later. The screen lit up with his name. Twice. She answered on the third. "You're escalating," he said, breathless. "You need to stop. Right now. We still have rights." "No," she said. "You had access. That's different. You can't just—" She hung up before he finished. No dramatics, no defense, just done. She returned to the dining room table. A final box sat open. Her mother's porcelain figurines, individually wrapped. She lifted one out, a ballerina with a chipped toe, delicate and still defiant. She set it gently into tissue, then closed the lid. The house was quiet again. Not the same kind of quiet as before. This one wasn't about exclusion, it was clarity. Outside, Ron paced the driveway. Janice pulled out her phone. Margaret didn't care who they called. Inside, she reached for her notebook and wrote, "Tuesday, 4:04 p.m. Lock engaged. Photos left. I've taken what was mine. What they thought was theirs was never given." She closed the book, then turned at the sound of a knock. Firm, steady, not family. A man stood at the door. Clipboard, shirt with a city badge. "Ms. Delaney?" he asked. "I'm here to confirm final occupancy status for title clearance." She stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "You're right on time." The title office smelled faintly of fresh paper and laminate, a manufactured kind of permanence. Margaret arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in tailored charcoal slacks and a crisp cream blouse, her silver pendant tucked just below the collarbone. Her cane tapped softly against the tile, steady and deliberate. The receptionist offered her water. Margaret declined. She took a seat near the window, folder in hand, expression unreadable but unafraid. Her nails were neatly filed. Her lipstick, a soft rose, not for presentation but for precision. At 9:02 a.m., John Keller walked in. Pressed shirt, no tie. A subtle limp in his left leg, the one that got pinned under an overturned sedan during a pileup in Fort Collins 3 years back. He'd mentioned it once during their first meeting and never again. He spotted her instantly. "Ms. Delaney," he said, hand extended. Margaret rose to meet him. "Mr. Keller?" They shook. Firm mutual. No rush. "I just wanted to say," he began, "thank you. You've made this easier than I ever expected. Most people, well, they don't hand off something this personal with so much grace." Margaret smiled, just slightly. "It stopped being personal the day someone else put their name on my bedroom door." He didn't ask questions. The notary called them in. Papers spread across a lacquered table that had probably outlived 4 office managers and a dozen pens. Signatures came first, then initials, then the ceremonial moment everyone always expected to feel more than it actually did. "Congratulations," the agent said, sliding the final page forward. "The property is now officially under John Keller's ownership. Funds are transferring." Margaret reached into her bag and withdrew a single brass key, polished, weighty. She placed it gently in John's open palm. "No copies," she said. "No strings." He nodded. "You'll be the first guest I invite if you ever want to see it again." Margaret shook her head. "Some doors you close. Some you gift. This one's yours now." They stood. She thanked the notary, nodded once to the receptionist on the way out, and stepped into the Colorado morning with her coat draped over one shoulder. Outside, a familiar SUV screeched into the parking lot. Brandon. His hair was disheveled, shirt untucked, one shoe half-laced. He slammed the door shut and sprinted toward the glass entry, waving an envelope like a last-minute defense. "Mom!" Security intercepted him before he reached the door. "I just need 5 minutes. She doesn't understand. She's being manipulated. This isn't right." Margaret stood just beyond the glass, watching. She didn't move. She didn't blink. Security never raised their voice. They didn't need to. Brandon's voice was doing all the damage itself. He argued with the air, gestured wildly at the closing folder pressed to the receptionist's chest, and finally, as if realizing he wasn't getting in, slammed both hands on the glass. Margaret turned away. She walked to her car, Tina's car, technically, and opened the passenger door just as her friend pulled in. "Is it done?" Tina asked, eyebrow raised. Margaret slid in, smooth and calm. "Done. Clean." They drove away while Brandon still shouted at the wind. That evening, long after the sun had sunk behind the mountains, John stood at the edge of his new driveway, a box tucked under one arm, porch light freshly screwed in, the front step newly swept. He unlocked the door with the key Margaret had given him. Inside, the house was still, but not empty. Every corner hummed with newness, with freedom. Across the street, behind the slats of a wooden fence, Janice stood in a floral robe, arms crossed tight. Ron peeked beside her, face slack. Neither spoke. They just watched. John closed the door behind him. Inside, the light turned warm. Back in her new home, Margaret poured a second glass of wine. She sat beside a stack of mail and opened a small envelope addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a note from the notary, a personal one. Not many people walk away with their name, their spine, and their silence intact. You did all 3. Margaret read it twice, then quietly tucked it into the back of her notebook. Across the table, her phone lit up again. Unknown number. She didn't pick up. She was already free, no announcement required. And in the hallway, the kettle whistled, low and steady, like punctuation at the end of a perfect clause. The walls were cream, not eggshell, not beige, cream. They gave nothing away, which Margaret liked. Tina carried in the last box and dropped it beside the small bookshelf with a dramatic huff. "Okay, if you tell me you want to rearrange again, I'm faking a back injury." Margaret gave a dry smile. "Your 2 throws and 1 lamp from perfection. Relax." They had started at 8 a.m. and worked in tandem, 2 women who didn't need words to move furniture. The recliner faced the window now, not the television. The bookshelf was stocked with paperbacks, spines creased and well-loved, and on the walls, no family photos, just 2 landscapes she'd bought years ago from a local fair. One showed a long fence disappearing into snow. The other, a single cardinal on a black branch. Margaret pinned the last frame into place and stepped back. The space didn't feel new, it felt correct. Tina stood beside her, arms crossed. "You sure you don't want that old family portrait somewhere?" "No," Margaret said, not cruel, just firm. That wasn't family. That was arrangement. The dining table only sat two. The kitchen was narrow, but the coffee pot clicked on automatically, which felt like a miracle after years of appliance gymnastics. A vase of mint from Tina's garden sat by the sink. Everything had breath now, even the corners. Margaret opened the last box, labeled simply, "Maybe." Inside were a few sweaters she hadn't worn in years, a scarf she once let Lacey borrow, and a blouse with a stain only she remembered. She closed the lid and wrote in Sharpie, "Donate." She didn't hesitate. Outside, the afternoon sun was doing its best to feel like spring. The breeze carried the smell of mulch and asphalt. Margaret sat on the porch steps with a glass of lemon water and watched the street pass by. Slowly, like life had loosened its belt and decided to breathe again. A woman walked up the path, short haircut, strong gait, and a Tupperware in one hand. "You must be Margaret," she said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I'm Andrea. I live 2 doors down. Saw the truck last week. Just wanted to say welcome." Margaret nodded, polite but cautious. "Thank you." Andrea held out the Tupperware. "Chicken pasta. Not from a box." I swear Margaret took it, surprised by the weight and the scent. Andrea hesitated. "You're the lady who sold the house on Fox Run, right?" Margaret didn't blink. "I heard someone else say it at the co-op, that you sold it, fast, to someone no one knew." Margaret gave the barest smile. "That sounds like someone else's business." Andrea held up her hands. "Fair enough. I just like knowing who's in the neighborhood." "I like knowing who I am," Margaret said. "It's a good start." Andrea laughed. "I'll let you settle in." Margaret watched her go, the woman's figure shrinking down the walk. Then she went back inside. She folded the dish towels once more, moved the chair an inch to the left, lit a small candle that smelled like eucalyptus and something else she couldn't name but liked anyway. Later, she walked 2 blocks to the drop-off center with the maybe box under her arm. A teen in a volunteer vest took it. "Thank you, ma'am." "No," Margaret said gently. "Thank you." Back home, the evening settled in early. The windows picked up amber reflections. Margaret sat by the bookshelf and reached for her journal. She opened to a clean page. Monday, 6:52 p.m. The house breathes differently. So do I. No noise behind the walls, no permissions to chase, no echoes I didn't invite. She paused, then added, "I didn't lose anything, I released it." The pen left a clean dot, and just as she set it down, the mail slot clicked open. Again. No envelope this time, just a single white card, folded. Margaret picked it up, turned it once, then again. Inside, in looping handwriting, was a question. "Would you ever consider coming to mediation?" She stared at it, then closed it without reacting. Some walls invited, others didn't. The law office conference room was overly beige, like someone had set out to design a space where nothing emotional could stick. Margaret took the seat farthest from the window and unfolded her reading glasses with quiet authority. Her attorney, Vanessa, sat to her right, pen already uncapped, folder already open. Calm, shield and sword in one. Across the polished table, Brandon fidgeted with a sweating water bottle. He wore a blazer he hadn't bothered to press and a look of performative exhaustion, like he'd been losing sleep for all the wrong reasons. Lacey hadn't come. The mediator cleared her throat gently. "Thank you all for agreeing to meet. Today's session is strictly non-binding, exploratory. Let's begin by hearing from both parties." Brandon leaned forward, elbows too sharp for the moment. "Look," he started, "this whole thing got out of hand. We weren't trying to take anything from her. It was Lacey's idea, okay? Her parents were struggling, and we thought we were helping. That's what families do. They help." Margaret said nothing. He kept going, words tumbling too fast. "Yeah, maybe we overstepped. Maybe we should have asked more questions. But I was raised in that house, Mom. It wasn't just yours. It was ours. You didn't even warn me before you made that decision." Still, Margaret said nothing. The mediator glanced her way gently. "Ms. Delaney, do you have a response?" Margaret opened her folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, notarized, signed, dated. She passed it across the table. Brandon picked it up, read silently. His lips moved with the lines. "I owe you nothing, but I wish you clarity." He blinked. "What the hell is this supposed to mean?" "It means I'm not angry," Margaret said, "but I'm not giving you another inch of myself to reshape." Brandon's face flushed, and for a second, something softer flickered behind his eyes. Maybe recognition, maybe shame. The mediator shifted forward slightly. "There is space, if desired, to discuss financial reconciliation, distribution of any residual assets, potential caregiver reimbursements, or transitional support for Mr. Delaney and his extended family." Margaret didn't even pause. "No." The mediator hesitated. "Would you like time to consider?" "No," Margaret said again, this time with finality. "The house was mine, and now it's someone else's. I've moved my body, my name, and my past. I didn't do it for leverage. I did it for peace." Brandon opened his mouth, but his attorney, a younger man with an anxious brow, subtly shook his head. Silence settled. Not tense. Just decided. The mediator closed her file. "Understood. Unless there's additional business, we'll adjourn." Vanessa nodded once. Brandon looked down at the table as if trying to rewind time through wood grain. Margaret stood. Vanessa followed. As they reached the door, Brandon rose suddenly. "Wait." Margaret turned, just enough to let him speak. His voice dropped. "So that's it?" She met his eyes. Not cold, not angry. Just clean. "Yes," she said. "That's it." Outside, the sky had shifted into soft steel. Clouds low, but not threatening. Vanessa exhaled as they reached the parking lot. Handled with absolute precision. "I'm not interested in punishment," Margaret replied. "Only closure." They parted with a nod. Margaret walked the rest of the block to Tina's car, which waited at a meter with hazard lights blinking. As she buckled in, Tina asked, "How'd he do?" Margaret looked out the window. "He asked for understanding. I gave him clarity instead." Tina nodded. "More durable anyway." Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out the letter again. "I owe you nothing, but I wish you clarity." She folded it once more and slid it back into the envelope, then turned it upside down. As Tina pulled away from the curb, a billboard flashed past advertising reverse mortgages, family wealth transfers, and retirement the way you imagined. Margaret snorted. "I already retired something." "What's that?" Tina asked. Margaret turned to the window. "Expectation." The photo arrived mid-morning, no subject line, just a single attachment and a short note from John Keller. "Figured you might want to see it. Took me all weekend. Not perfect yet, but it's finally mine. Thanks again for the clean slate. You gave me a future." Margaret opened the image. It was the porch. Her old porch, but not as she remembered. The wood had been stripped and sanded, then painted a slate blue so crisp it looked like breath in winter. The peeling shutters were gone. The sagging gutter, replaced. A simple welcome mat sat squarely in the center of the top step. No rocking chair, no wind chimes, no ghosts, just a clean frame, ready for whatever came next. She stared at it longer than she meant to. Then she printed it, quietly. The printer whirred, slow and methodical. When it finished, she clipped the sheet neatly and slid it into the drawer of her writing desk, the one with no key but a lock only memory could pick. Across the kitchen, Tina leaned against the fridge with a peeled clementine in hand. "Was that from John?" Margaret nodded once. "He says thank you." Tina grinned. "You know you're kind of a folk hero now, right?" Margaret raised one eyebrow. "Folk hero?" "You should see the women at book club. Half of them are dreaming of eviction. The other half are asking how to write a trust." Margaret gave a dry smile. "I didn't want justice." "What did you want?" "Distance." Tina paused her peeling. "And do you have it now?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She picked up the kettle, filled it, and set it to boil. Steam curled like a signature from the spout. Then she said, It's finally quiet inside my own mind. Tina let that hang, then offered the last wedge of the clementine without a word. Margaret accepted. That night she fell asleep before 10. No podcasts to drown out the thoughts, no texts from Brandon, no guilt sickness that sat like cold stone behind the ribcage. Just breathe, even, whole, unshared. The next morning she woke without an alarm, made oatmeal she didn't rush, and took her time brushing her hair. Her skin looked brighter, her shoulder didn't ache as much. She moved through the apartment like someone who had put the right name on the right deed. By noon, she was sitting outside with a small legal pad on her lap, not to write, just to notice. 2 boys across the street were drawing sidewalk cities with bright chalk. Their mother called them in for lunch, and one shouted, "Can I finish the airport first?" Margaret smiled. No legacy to fix. No territory to reclaim. Just a woman, sitting still. The mail came late. Mostly junk, an AARP envelope, 2 grocery flyers, a catalog she didn't remember signing up for, and 1 letter from a local foundation she didn't recognize. Inside was a simple proposal. "We're expanding our speaker series on elder independence. Your name came up. We'd be honored if you'd consider sharing your story." She folded the letter back into its envelope. Didn't say yes, didn't say no, just placed it beneath the photo from John. 2 lives remade in silence. Her phone buzzed once. Not a call, just a message. From a number labeled unknown. "Heard about what you did. I understand now. I'm sorry I didn't sooner. No name. But she didn't need one." She read it once. Then deleted it. She didn't respond. Some messages were apologies. Others were just echoes. Inside, the tea kettle sang again, steady and clear. Margaret rose without hurry. She no longer ran to answer anything, because for the first time in years, no part of her life was borrowed. And the porch in the photo? It wasn't hers. And that was the point. The recorder clicked on with a soft mechanical chirp. Margaret sat upright, hands folded on the cafe table, a cup of chamomile tea cooling beside her. She wore the same slate blue cardigan she'd favored through the worst of winter. A quiet nod to constancy in a conversation about change. Across from her, a local reporter, maybe 30 at most, leaned forward with a practiced smile and a slim notepad. "I really appreciate you meeting," the young woman said. "There's been a lot of buzz since the foundation mentioned your name. People are calling you brave." Margaret raised an eyebrow, just enough to shift the air. "I didn't jump into a river to save a drowning child," she said. "I just moved out of my own home." The reporter chuckled, a little nervous, and clicked her pen. "Still, the way you did it, it resonated. We're hoping to feature your experience in our Elder Autonomy Spotlight series. Just your words, no dramatization." Margaret nodded once. "Then you can keep the names out of it." "Of course," the reporter said quickly. "We're not here to assign blame, just to inform. Your story. It's more common than people realize. Seniors being displaced within their own homes. Multi-generational arrangements that slowly turn into erasure." Margaret looked past her, toward the cafe window. A dog trotted by on a leash too long. Someone across the street adjusted a child's backpack. The city moved on, always. "I don't need a headline," she said, "but if someone reads this and realizes it's not selfish to say no or to draw a boundary in your own kitchen, then I'll have said enough." The reporter clicked the recorder again. "Tell me how it started." Margaret exhaled. Not deeply. Not dramatically. Just enough to steady her voice. "I had surgery. I came home, and my bed was full of someone else's shoes." For the next 40 minutes, she told the story not like a victim, but like a witness. Calm. Measured. No venom. No vengeance. She talked about boundaries, how they don't vanish overnight, but disappear one polite compromise at a time. She described bank forms, legal reshuffling, the weight of porcelain figurines packed into boxes no one else would ever open. She never said Brandon's name, never said, "my son." But she didn't have to. Her voice sharpened when she talked about feeling invisible at her own table, softened when she mentioned the buyer's porch, newly painted, grew quiet only once, when describing the day she put the house key in someone else's hand and felt nothing but relief. The recorder clicked off. The reporter looked at her like someone watching a lighthouse blink on for the first time. "We'll run it next Sunday," she said. "Title's tentative, but the editor's leaning toward, 'She sold the house.'" She kept her dignity. Margaret gave a half smile. "Not bad. But I didn't keep it. I reclaimed it." The article went live the following week. Within 24 hours, it had been shared 7,200 times. By Thursday, the foundation's inbox was full. Dozens of emails from women named Rita and Joan and Cheryl, all of them writing things like, "Thank you for putting words to what I didn't even know I was afraid of." A week later, a local law firm sent a formal proposal. They'd sponsor an elder advocacy workshop in her name if she'd lend it. Tina texted her a screenshot of the article header with a fire emoji and, "Told you, folk hero." Margaret didn't reply right away. She was in her studio, a small sunlit room at the back of her new apartment, a space not built for anyone else's convenience. She reached into her drawer, pulled out John's porch photo, and slid it into a new frame. One of those sleek acrylic ones, no border, no nostalgia, just the image, whole and bare. That evening, she stood at her window as the sun fell behind the rooftops and shadows stretched clean across the pavement. She thought of her old porch, how it used to creak like it was protesting her every step. And then she thought of the front stoop in John's picture. It looked ready. For what, she didn't know. But it no longer had to be hers. Margaret opened her phone one final time. The screen blinked awake, messages stacked in gray rows she no longer bothered to read. 4 missed calls from Brandon-Cell, 2 voicemails marked urgent, 1 text that read only, "Mom, please don't ignore me." She pressed and held the contact until a red menu appeared. "Block this caller. Confirm." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was decisive. She set the phone face down on the side table and exhaled. That afternoon, she called the utility company and closed the last account still tied to the Fox Run address. Internet, gone. Power, transferred. Gas, discontinued. The man on the phone was polite. He asked for her forwarding address. "I'm not forwarding," she said. "I'm choosing new." She didn't even keep the confirmation email. By week's end, Margaret had joined the neighborhood book club. Not because she needed company, but because she wanted to hear voices that didn't come wrapped in obligation. The women were blunt, curious, and wildly overprepared. One brought homemade cinnamon scones, another insisted the ending of the novel was emotionally manipulative garbage. Margaret brought wine. She said little, but she laughed once, at a joke she didn't expect, and the sound startled her. It had been so long since she'd heard herself laugh without scanning the room afterward. The next morning, she laced her sneakers, tied them twice, and walked the full loop of the neighborhood. No destination, no errands, just breath and sidewalk. Later, Tina showed up with 2 cans of paint, a collapsible easel, and a canvas roll tucked under one arm. "I thought you were always curious about watercolor," she said. "Today's your day." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I'm not exactly Georgia O'Keeffe." "You don't have to be," Tina said, already setting up the studio corner by the sunniest window. "You just have to show up." They laid out the brushes in a clean row, opened the windows, let the light pour in like a quiet invitation. Margaret dipped the first brush into water and stared at the canvas. It looked back, blank, unbothered, entirely unclaimed. She swirled the brush in a pale green tint and touched it to the surface. A small stroke, slightly uneven, but it held. She smiled. That night, she journaled again. Tuesday, 7:38 p.m. Blocked the number, closed the last door, walked for no reason, laughed once, by accident. "I think I'm becoming someone I recognize." She capped the pen. From the corner of the room, Tina looked up from a catalog. "When are you going to let someone hang your work?" Margaret chuckled. "It's barely work." "It's barely private either," Tina said. "You're already leaving fingerprints." Margaret turned back to her latest canvas. A burst of soft blue bleeding into a field of yellow. A horizon that didn't exist anywhere specific. She traced the top edge with her finger and whispered half to herself, "This is how legacy really works." Not in portraits, not in paperwork, but in brushstrokes no one demanded, in laughter no one had to earn, in mornings that didn't require explanation. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of pine and something crisp, maybe rain, maybe just renewal. Inside, the canvas dried slowly. She didn't rush it, and in the background, her phone remained face down, quiet, undisturbed. She never turned it over, because some messages deserve no reply, and some lives, finally, write themselves without permission. The street looked the same. The number hadn't changed, but the house was different. Margaret stepped from the passenger side as John opened the gate himself, smiling in a way that was part pride, part gratitude. She hadn't been back since the closing, hadn't looked at it, except in the photo he'd sent. In person, it felt even less like hers. And that, she realized, was its greatest gift. The porch gleamed, not just freshly painted but reimagined. String lights arched gently across the entry, soft as breath. The bushes had been trimmed back, and where the old fake ficus once stood, a real planter now sat with rosemary spilling over the rim. John held the door open. "You made it." She stepped inside. Warm wood floors. No more scuffed corners. No more mismatched furniture. The air smelled faintly of cedar and orange. No lavender, no citrus cleaner, just a quiet newness. The hallway curved gently toward what had once been her bedroom. But first, the crowd. A dozen or more people clustered in the living room, holding paper plates of appetizers, laughing in comfortable tones. Someone was tuning a guitar near the back door. A woman in her 30s leaned in and asked John, "Hey, who's your guest?" John looked over at Margaret with an expression that held not a trace of pity, just reverence. "She's the woman who trusted me," he said. Margaret didn't flinch. The woman nodded, smiled, and said, "Then this house owes you both." John led her through the crowd, not as if showing her off, but as if escorting someone whose presence meant the home had officially arrived. He stopped at the end of the hallway, hand gently resting on the doorframe. "Still want to see the place?" he asked. She nodded. The room had been painted a soft, pale gray. No curtains yet, but sunlight poured in with no resistance. The closet was empty. A small armchair sat near the window, and on the side table was a mug with a cracked rim. The kind you only keep if it means something. Margaret stepped into the room and closed her eyes for one breath. Just one. She didn't remember the echo. She remembered the silence she used to wear here. "I almost didn't keep anything," John said quietly, "but there's one thing out back you might want to see." They walked to the garden. The grass had been reseeded. Mulch was still fresh. But in the corner, just beneath the kitchen window, one thing remained: the rose bush. Her rose bush. It had been trimmed carefully, not pruned to death like Ron once insisted it needed. The yellow blooms were brighter than they'd ever been under her care. John gestured to it. "Took me a while to realize what it was, but once I figured it out, I kept it. Everything else changed. That didn't need to." Margaret bent slightly and touched the edge of one bloom. The petals were warm from the sun. Open. She smiled. "That's the only thing worth keeping." John didn't respond. He didn't have to. As they walked back through the hallway, someone laughed from the front porch. Someone she didn't know. Someone who'd never called her Maggie, and that was the beauty of it. No one here had any idea who she used to be. No one expected a version of her that had already died. Back at the entry, she turned to John one last time. "You've done well. You made it possible," he said. She opened the door and stepped into the light. Not because she had to leave, but because she'd already arrived. She didn't glance back, not even once. Some rooms you lose, some homes you take with you.